A number of technologies grew and matured during the Great War. Airplanes, submarines, radio, zeppelins, terrible technologies like shrapnel, artillery munitions, and poison gas. But one technology rose above the rest in the Great War. It has been called the first and only Railway War. Railroads were so important to the prosecution of the Great War that the timing of the start of the First World War was based on the existing railway schedules. The German better control of their railway network was one of the reasons that they were able to more quickly deploy more troops and gain success in the early part of the war. And as the war went on, it was the ability to move masses of reinforcements by rail to any point of attack that turned the Great War into the bloody static war that it was. And rail was just as important on the home front. In the United Kingdom, for the first time in the UK's history, the railway networks were all brought under government control. And the extensive British railway network served the United Kingdom's war effort in immeasurable ways. But it also contributed to the worst rail disaster in the history of the British Isles. It is history that deserves to be remembered. The United Kingdom realized the importance of rail for war preparations even before the Great War started. In 1912, the Railway Executive Committee was formed to manage railways in Britain in the event of an emergency such as war. The REC was to act as an intermediary between the various British railway companies and the War Office. There was roughly twice as much track in the United Kingdom in 1912 as there is today, and routes and stations were under the control of different companies. While the railway companies already worked with the War Office, for example, moving troops for training and during maneuvers, it was quickly recognized that a much greater degree of coordination would be required if Britain were to go to war. Trains were the only real option to move soldiers and sailors, their equipment, weapons, horses, and vehicles. The need was even more acute as the huge amount of horses requisitioned in war would further limit ground freight movement. Britain understood that railways would be a central technology in the war that was already on the horizon. The railways established plans and timetables to move troops and equipment to ports of embarkation in case of war, and all that was coordinated by the REC, who kept the timetables and distributed them in something called the War Book. On August 4th, 1914, when the United Kingdom officially declared war, the Railway Executive Committee officially took direct government control of 130 railways in the United Kingdom. The war caused a special problem for the British Railway Service as men left to serve in the war. Over 180,000 British railway workers enlisted. Many of those went to work on the rail that supported troops in France, part of the Railway Operating Division of the Royal Engineer Corps. More than 20,000 of the British railway workers that went to war never made it home from the European battlefields. Famously, more women were hired to help make up for the shortage of railway workers at home. The number of women employed by the British railway companies went from about 13,000 at the start of the war to over 68,000. Production was turned to a number of specialized cars for use by the military, although shortages meant that older and less safe carriages, often in a state of disrepair, were also pressed into service. Specially designed wagons were built to convey Army and Navy equipment and fuel. Specialized trains included hospital trains that could be a third of a mile long, that transported more than 1.25 million injured and sick troops to hospitals throughout the United Kingdom over the course of the war. And the Jellicoe Specials, trains named for Admiral of the Fleet John Jellicoe, that carried coal from southern Wales to the Royal Navy Fleet in the Orkney Islands. By the end of the war, more than 100 Jellicoe Specials were running every week. But of course, the central role of the railways in the Great War was directly moving troops. Many army camps were provided with new branch lines and sidings, as were new munitions factories. At Richborough, Kent, a new port was built and included the world's first roll-on, roll-off rail ferry. In the first 2 weeks of the war, 1,408 special trains ran, taking troops to ports of embarkation for France. The scale was staggering. Over a period of 3 weeks in 1914, a troop train would arrive at the Southampton docks every 12 minutes during the course of a 14-hour day. By August 31st, 1914, just 27 days after entering the war, trains to Southampton had transported more than 118,000 Army personnel, 37,000 horses, 314 artillery pieces, and 5,200 vehicles. And the trains would keep rolling, carrying men and equipment to the ports that would carry them to France or the far-flung battlefields of the Great War. In May of 1915, one of those units that was being transported was the 7th Battalion of the Royal Scots. Originally raised in 1633, the Royal Scots were, at the time of the Great War, the oldest and most senior infantry regiment of the line of the British Army. The Royal Scots Regiment expanded quickly during the Great War. The 7 battalions of the so-called Territorial Force were mobilized, and 7 more battalions of volunteers were raised under Kitchener's new army scheme. By the end of 1914, the regiment included 24 battalions, and 10 more were added in 1915. All told, the Royal Scots raised more than 100,000 troops during the Great War, almost half of which would end up as casualties, killed or wounded. The Territorial Force had been created in 1909 as a part-time volunteer force designed to augment British land forces as a unified auxiliary without resorting to conscription. At first, the territorial battalions, not well regarded by the regular army, were only used for home defense, freeing regular army battalions for foreign service. But as the demands for the war increased, the territorial forces were increasingly deployed to the front. One such unit was the 7th Battalion of the Royal Scots Guards. Mobilized in what was then the city of Leith in August of 1914, the 7th RS spent the first several months of the war manning coastal defenses around Edinburgh. But in April 1915, they were sent for additional training, meaning that they were going to be deployed to the front. They expected that they were going to be sent to France, but that was not the Army's plan. On the evening of May 21st, 1915, the battalion was mobilized and issued with ammunition, blankets, and bedding, and to their surprise, sun helmets, the sure sign that France was not their destination. The men of the battalion were instead being sent to the Mediterranean, to the bloody conflict at the mouth of the Dardanelles, called the Gallipoli Campaign. Originally, the men of the 7th RS should have shipped out a day earlier on May 21st, but the troop ship that was intended to carry them had run aground in the Mersey River, and so the battalion was mobilized a day later, and they left on the morning of May 22nd. The battalion was loaded onto 2 trains. The first train left at 4 a.m., and the second left 2 hours later. The second train, including about half the men of the 1,000-man battalion, included 21 wooden carriages, with men packed 8 to a compartment. The Caledonian Railway was formed in 1845, at a period when local railway concerns in the United Kingdom were developing into longer lines between cities and broader networks. The idea of the line was to connect local Scottish lines with the incipient English networks that were forming. The main line of the railway connected Glasgow to Carlisle using the 4-foot 8.5-inch standard gauge, and when it was completed in 1848, it was the first continuous railway route between Glasgow and London. There were competing lines connecting Scottish cities to the English network, but the Caledonian Line was a popular railway. The town of Gretna was just on the Scottish side of the Anglo-Scottish border. About a mile north of Gretna Junction on the Caledonian Main Line was the Quintinshill Signalbox. Quintinshill wasn't a town. The spot had probably been named for a house that was nearby in the 1850s, but by 1915 the house was gone. What Quintinshill was a place where there were 2 passing loops, one on either side of the northbound and southbound tracks of the Caledonian Main Line. Passing loops are short sections of track connected to the main track that allow trains to pass each other. On the morning of May 22nd, 2 northbound overnight sleeping car expresses were running late, so the local service from Carlisle had to be sidelined to allow the sleepers to pass. But a goods train was occupying the loop on the northbound track, and so the local was shunted onto the southbound track. A special freight train of empty coal wagons was coming southbound and was placed on the southbound loop. The first of the sleeper cars passed by northbound. The signalmen were making a shift change, the morning signalman, James Tinsley, having arrived late on the local that was now parked on the southbound track. He and the night signalman, George Meakin, were chatting in the signal box. The second troop train, carrying the men of the Royal Scots, was headed southbound. It's still not completely clear why the accident occurred. There were several breaches of regulations involved, but it appears that Tinsley and Meakin simply were distracted. As the troop train came, they signaled it through, apparently having forgotten that the local was still parked on the southbound track. The train full of sleeping soldiers was traveling at some 80 miles an hour when it struck the parked local train at approximately 6:49 a.m. The collision was so hard that the leading carriages of the troop train hopped right over the locomotive of the local. The rest of the train compressed, spilling over onto the northbound tracks. Some 215 yards of train were compressed into less than 70 yards of space. Fire started almost immediately. The cars were lighted by gas lamps, and the canisters of gas under the wooden train carriages had ruptured and were ignited by the coals from the train's tinderbox. Soldiers were thrown, crushed, trapped, trying desperately to escape the burning wreckage. But less than 30 seconds later, a whistle started blowing. The second northbound sleeper was desperately trying to stop, but there was not enough time. It struck the wreckage at nearly 50 miles per hour. Many of the men who had managed to escape the initial collision were mowed down. A survivor, Peter Stoddard of Leith, was interviewed in 1985. He said, "I think I prayed. The express hit us and I lost consciousness as I was thrown into the air. I came to halfway down an embankment by the track." The survivors, as well as nearby farm workers and villagers, alerted by the noise, came and started to pull men from the wreckage. Some men had to have limbs amputated on site to get them free. There is a persistent rumor that some men who were trapped were shot to keep them from being burned to death. Stoddard says he saw it happen. Rachel Nimmo, 28 years old, and her 1-year-old son Dixon, traveling from Newcastle, were the only passengers on the local train killed. 7 died on the express, including a 43-year-old Scottish engineer and 3 Army and 2 naval officers. The driver and fireman of the troop train and a sleeping car attendant on the express train also died. That was horrible enough, but the mass of the casualties were among the men of the Royal Scots. The official death toll listed by the Army was 210, with another 224 injured. Only 83 of the Royal Scots dead could be identified. Of the 499 officers and men on the train, only 58 men and 7 officers were present for roll call that afternoon. The accident was devastating for the town of Leith, where it was said that there was not a family in the town untouched by the tragedy. The Quintinshill train disaster is still today the worst rail disaster in British history. Tinsley, Meakin, and a man named George Hutchinson, who was the fireman on the local train, were charged in both Scotland, where the accident occurred, and England, where many of the victims died. They became the first men to be indicted for the same crime in 2 different United Kingdom countries, although they were tried in Scotland. Hutchinson was found not guilty, but Tinsley and Meakin were convicted of culpable homicide. They served a little over a year and were released in December of 1916, where they were immediately re-employed by the Caledonian Railway. That fact was part of the reason that the British Broadcasting Corporation, in a 2015 reanalysis of the accident, postulated that they might have conspired with the Caledonian Railway and the British government, who was technically in charge of the line, to take sole responsibility for the accident, thus exonerating the people that were running the railway. They faulted the railway operators for knowingly ignoring violations of regulations, for overburdening their signalmen by trying to keep peacetime service running, despite the increased demands of the war, in order to preserve profits, and for negligently endangering the soldiers by putting them in wooden railway cars that they knew to be less safe. The bodies of 101 men of the Royal Scots were buried together in a mass grave in Edinburgh's Rosebank Cemetery. The funeral procession was lined by more than 3,000 soldiers and thousands of citizens. A memorial to the dead troops was erected in the cemetery in 1916. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.